Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Bullets and Bourbon. My name is Matt Gunlock, and tonight I have returning guest Adam Majors. So the last episode we did was Adam and I did was with Carl Marlantes, which was an absolutely epic conversation that I really enjoyed. Before that, we covered chapter two of the book Odysseus and the Oar, and before that, it was kind of an overview of the book itself. This time, we're going to be talking about chapter three, which is the land of the Lotus Eaters. And so, before we kind of get into the questions, Adam, welcome on again. I really appreciate you doing this. But can you kind of go into what you mean by the land of the Lotus Eaters?
Yeah, so thanks for having me back, first of all. And, um, you know, as we're kind of walking through the Odyssey, um, Odysseus has left Troy after fighting there for 10 years. And the first thing that he and his men do is they go to uh, the a place called Ismarus, where they raid the town and they put all the men to the sword, they kill them. And some accounts, some interpretations, they rape the women and they steal all their shit. They just raid the town. And so even though they've left war behind, they're still behaving as if they're at war. They're still caught up in this psychological adaptation, um, continuing to act and behave as if they are still in combat. And so it's kind of depicting these guys who, even though they're on their way home, they are not prepared to return home. They
Hmm.
have not done any of the psychological or emotional work that is going to allow them to adapt to their inner world and begin the work of healing. Where they land next is in the land of the Lotus Eaters. So that's kind of how it's referred to in the literature. And when you read the Odyssey and it talks about the land of the Lotus Eater, it says, that all who eat lotus forget all about their home, and they really don't care about anything else. Nothing else is important to them anymore. All their concerns, all their cares, all their worries, all their longings, all that just kind of fades away, and lotus takes over. So it's been compared by a number of authors, including Jonathan Shea, who's a VA psychiatrist, um, to addiction. But for me, in my book, I relate to it more as like a kind of unconsciousness in general. And I share a dream in the book where, and this was years after I had been sober myself, but in this dream, I was intoxicated and I
Mm.
wasn't really relating to reality. That I had done something where I was intoxicated and it was interfering with my relationships in the dream. And I share that dream just to kind of portray the fact that even though a person could be sober, you could be somebody who doesn't drink any alcohol or do any drugs. And the reality of the psyche is that there are things that happen in the psyche that can take us away from who we are and help us, cause us to forget about what's really important. So the land of the Lotus Eaters, I think, is something all returning warriors and really anybody who's on a journey to find themselves, this is something they have to be careful about falling into.
No, no, I appreciate that depiction because I think it really helps paint the picture of what most people go through without even realizing. And, so I've kind of quickly summarized some things and I'm going to follow it up with some questions. But if you forget your pain, you forget your homeland. Always being stuck in the on position, ready to react. War becomes your home. These are all feelings that we have shared, anger and the emotion that has kept us alive. We are most vulnerable when we initially come back from combat or a high risk situation if you're law enforcement. An example I'll give is, the last time I was overseas, um, I had opportunities to go participate in some missions, and then I went other to another place where I got to watch things on screen. But I was just constantly go, 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 go. Not always in harmful situations, but never really got to decompress from anything. And so I flew home to England to go visit family shortly after a mission, and my nephew was pointing a toy gun at me, and I had warned him prior to that, "Hey, stop." he didn't listen. The second time, I didn't give a warning. I snapped and brought him into tears. And, at the time, after it happened, I felt horrible, and I told my sister-in-law that, hey, um, I'm sorry for my outburst. And she was like, hey, it's fine. He should have listened the first time. But I still remember back to that day and remind myself that I can't ever become that person ever again. Like, that was a quick snap outburst. Um, it was roughly around Christmas time, and I was just an ugly person, if you want to call it that. But what are some things that can be done prior to the return home to prevent outbursts like that? And then for law enforcement officers who experience stress and is in constantly in the on position, what are some things they can do to decompress prior to going home and being with family?
Yep. Those are big questions. And for me, I tend to think a little bit bigger picture, right?
Hmm.
Um, and uh, so if we're going to kind of zoom out a little bit, um, and think about, beyond the military, beyond law enforcement, think about the culture as a whole.
Hmm.
Um, in my view, one of the biggest challenges that we have within like the veteran first responder community is that we really don't have an adequate map for relating to these kinds of challenges at all, which is why I wrote my book and why I'm kind of trying to use the Odyssey as a map to relate to the mythological dimension, which, mythology was the original psychology.
Hmm.
And you could say that psychology is the new mythology.
Yeah.
That back in the old days, in ancient times, when people were suffering, they looked to their myths to guide them about how to work through whatever struggle they were going through.
Yeah.
And they had rituals and ceremonies that fit together with those myths to help these people adapt and reorient themselves to overcome the challenge. Now, when we had science come along and it showed the people that Zeus is not really on Mount Olympus,
Hmm.
and so on and so forth, as Nietzsche said, the gods are dead. And so, and also when you take religion literally, like when it's not about a symbolic thing about relating to this in terms of your inner life, when it's taken literally that it's about some people or some person who lived however many thousands of years ago, that psychological meaning can get lost, and then it loses the ability to guide you. So, um, psychology happened to be born kind of as religion was dying out. And that psychology, you could say, is the new mythology. Like it's taking the place that mythology, where mythology used to help us out. And so now we have this new myth in psychology about what is wrong with us and what we do to work through these challenges. So to go to your question, you know, what can we do to help folks so they don't have to suffer in this way or have these kinds of outbursts? Like, how do we help somebody get out of combat mode? And I think in terms of big picture, in a perfect world, young men and young women would begin getting exposed to this kind of material in their youth, in their adolescence, right? So in the ancient world, people would have been initiated into manhood or womanhood and helped to understand, their role and what it looks to be a mature man or a mature woman, right? And that there be some myth to guide a person through all this, right? And one of the most quintessential mythological um, themes is that of the encounter with the shadow, right? Where this wild hairy man or this gross detestable figure or this dark scary thing, and that dark scary thing ultimately represents a part of us that can seem a little wild or rough around the edges or unhinged, right?
Hmm.
And that if you don't know the shadow is there, if you don't know that you have this beast-like thing in you, it can create a lot of problems for you. But if you know it's there, it can be a gift. And so it's kind of like you think about the story of like Theseus in the labyrinth,
Hmm.
that the Minotaur is actually named Asterion, which means a star. So if related to properly, this half man, half beast like thing can be a gift. And Odysseus, which I'm sure you and I will eventually talk about this, but Odysseus kind of runs into this figure himself in Polyphemus the Cyclops. That's this big, wild, hairy man who seems super primitive, who could actually be a gift to him if he knew how to relate to him the right way, but he doesn't. And so I'd say a lot of veterans and first responders, we've never been helped to understand that there's a shadow in us, that there's a part of us that is often wounded and that needs care and attention. And then it needs to be related to as something that needs to be nurtured, you
Hmm.
know, and that when we don't relate to this part of us that is there in the background, that's the thing that can burst out. And so I'd say, big picture, I mean, ideally in a perfect world, getting exposure to the concept of shadow and the unconscious, that all of us have parts of us that we need to recognize and tend to. That's really important. But for returning veterans or for first responders, I think, we need to kind of create a culture. I think books like Carl's, What It's Like to Go to War, and then my book, Odysseus in the War, these books I think are like the seeds that if we take this stuff in, then in another generation or so, we can hopefully mature as a culture, as the veteran community, first responder community, into something that's more mature and helping others understand these ideas and tend to these parts of them that need attention before they erupt or blow up. So, did that make sense?
Yeah, and I kind of wanted to touch on another thing because you and I talked about this prior to recording the Coral Marlantes episode. It was probably about a week before when we were still discussing this episode. And I remember you saying, one thing that Carl said, and this kind of stuck out to me and kind of stuck true. One thing that can be done is instead of just flying straight back home or taking a boat straight back home, uh, having about a month on boat or on whatever, and having the NCOs and staff NCOs and the officers talk to the Marines and the soldiers and everybody and utilizing that time to help them understand what they just went through and
Yep.
that it's okay to feel that pain and just kind of get to know each other and reorient yourself to the truth. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think just imagine this, right? So imagine that you're coming back from your deployment and that somewhere along the journey home, right, before you're just released out into the wild,
Hmm.
imagine if somewhere along your journey home, you're taken to um, an intensive form of you know uh, an intensive transitional experience led by other combat veterans who have faced their inner worlds.
Hmm.
And it could be veterans from any war, but imagine that you have this intensive transitional experience where now it's kind of like the opposite of boot camp. And Carl Marlantes calls it a war detox experience, is what he calls it. And this is essentially what the Battle Within is, where I work as the clinical manager,
Hmm.
is you think of it as a war detox. But imagine if we organize this for the military community, where you get off your deployment and before you're released, you go through like a 5 day intensive where these seasoned combat veterans who have faced their inner worlds, who have adapted to overcome these challenges, are passing these tools on to you, and that they're initiating you into the post-war and veteran life, right? And so for me, that would be the ultimate aim of my own work. If
Hmm.
I could do anything, if I had a magic wand, it would be to, hey, politicians, you know, draft up some legislation and and um let's create a funding mechanism to create a um, a unit that's dedicated to transition, in a legitimate way. Of course, like in the army, we have warrior transition units and stuff, but they're all bullshit. It's
Hmm.
basically just like I mean, it's nonsense. It has no soul. It has no depth. And so it's more about like, let me give you some vague and not too helpful resources and educate you a little bit about um, places you can go if you have trouble, rather than showing you, guys, here's how we overcome the inevitable struggles. They're about to kick us right in the ass, you
Well,
know?
I just remember, this is going back to 2005, and I just realized the other week, a few weeks ago, February 19th was the 20-year anniversary of whenever I went to Iraq the first time.
Wow.
And I mean, it's like, wow, where is the time fucking
I
gone?
know. I know.
And like uh 2 months here, it's gonna be, yeah, 2 months exactly. It's going to be the anniversary, almost 2 years exactly. May 8th is the 20-year anniversary of when a good friend of mine was killed on the start of Operation Matador. And then,
Wow.
you fast forward to later in the year, um, it's my return home 20 years ago. And I remember, while we were sitting in Al Asad, or Kuwait or wherever, I don't fucking remember at this point. I think it was Al Asad. We were just waiting. Um, I just remember that um, the chaplain came in, talked to us for an hour. It was a bullshit class that he gave us about transitioning back into the real world, and then that was it. We all got home. We all went to see our families. I remember driving home, avoiding every pothole there was because IEDs were pretty big back then, as you know.
Yep.
Um, and then that was it. There was really nothing else given to help people kind of understand what they just went through.
Yeah.
My best friend back then, he had it the roughest. He got back home and he had extended to go on that deployment. He didn't have to deploy over to Iraq at that time, but he extended to stay on with the unit and deploy. And so when he got back home, he had less than 30 days to transition out of the Marine Corps. So you go from 7 months in combat, you have 30 days to get out, and then you're back home in your hometown.
Oh yeah.
His transition, yeah, quite honestly, it was one of the worst transitions I've ever seen in my life.
Oh
He
yeah.
quickly got engaged, to a girl he barely met. That didn't work out. Um, you know, he spent time in a mental health unit, inpatient, and at the VA. He doesn't even remember that happening. And the only reason why he even knew about it is I had called him a couple times while he was in there during that week, and then I drove down there that weekend because his parents and I were very close,
Yep.
and I was down in his hometown all the time up until I transitioned out of the Marine Corps the first time.
Yep.
And it was a really rough go for him. And I mean,
Yep.
he's doing splendid now. Like he's a rock star now. And it's great to see that everything is turned around for him. But it's like you look at that and you're like, wow, that really was a broken process. And it,
Yeah.
it was something that's never really changed.
Oh no. It's crazy. I mean, I I can't help but think about my own experience of coming home. When you share that story, but the yeah, I mean, I was in the National Guard when I went to Iraq in 2007, 2008, and spent a year in Baghdad IED hunting,
Hmm.
driving around Baghdad getting bombs off the road. When we came home, we went to Fort McCoy, Wisconsin, I think for 3 days. So we go from Kuwait or Baghdad to Kuwait. We were in Kuwait for, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 days. So we're running missions one day. So I ran my last mission, was in Kuwait 24 hours later, like literally like saw combat on my second to last mission. Um, in Kuwait a couple days after that, in Kuwait for a couple days, and we were there longer than we were supposed to be because of a sandstorm.
Hmm.
Then we were in at Fort McCoy, Wisconsin for 3 days. We get a hearing test. We do some briefings. Something else I'll never forget, we get off the airplane and they took our weapons from us. We like literally walk off the airplane, go into a hangar where they have these giant cardboard boxes,
That's
and
traumatizing right there.
they took our weapons from us. And it was like, dude, this thing fucking kept us alive for the last year. And you're just gonna take my weapon, like no goodbye. Like there's
Hmm.
no ceremony. Like I don't get to say goodbye to this thing. Like imagine taking a fucking, sword from a knight with no ceremony,
Yeah.
no no appreciation for how meaningful this is. And like no one told us that was about to happen. You don't get a moment to process. It was like I dropped my fucking rifle and my pistol in a box, and then I'd go and smoke with my friends,
Hmm.
you know. And but yeah, so we're in Fort McCoy for 3 days. They put half the company on a bus that was going back to Kansas City, um, drove us to the airport, flew home. I was with my family, and I was so fucking confused at how all of a sudden I was home. It
Yeah.
didn't seem real. I was in denial. The first thing I did, because I didn't have a license at the time, because when I was home on leave, one of our guys had gotten killed 2 days before I went on leave, and then another one of my platoon mates died when I was on leave, and I got word about it. So I got really drunk on leave, got a DWI. So I go home. I don't have a license, which is all relevant to this land of the Lotus Eater thing, right?
Hmm.
Um, but the first thing I did, so me and my family went out to eat at some like, Japanese restaurant. And then I had my parents take me to, um, the grocery store, and I got some Dr. Pepper and some Southern Comfort. And I basically sat on the front porch of their house, outside by myself, drinking and playing guitar and smoking cigarettes. And all I wanted to do was just go back. I was like, fuck this. Like, fuck this. Like, why did I come home? I should have just stayed there. I should have just volunteered to stay, because even that short exposure I had to, you know, society was just like, I do not want to be a part of this. This is
Hmm.
depressing. Like, what the hell am I doing here? You know? And, I didn't want to talk to anyone. I remember my mom coming out to sit with me. She just wanted to talk. And I wanted nothing to do with anyone. I couldn't really, there was no empathy to appreciate
Yep.
what they must have been going through all this time. Um, I wasn't really concerned with that. I was lost. And basically, I mean, I was in the land of the Lotus Eaters. That was kind of
Yeah.
my first stop, was
Yeah.
just I am lost there. I am frustrated. I want to go back and I have no recourse. And I don't want to be a part of this place where I am, like I don't want to be a part of the society. Like fuck it, let me go back to war, and that door is closed. So for me, it was just I'm just gonna get as drunk as I can, as much as I can.
Yeah,
Um, and I,
I remember that first weekend myself too because I went my parents had moved from Miami and they moved up to Lynchburg, Virginia, and I knew nobody there except my parents and they introduced me to a gentleman, Bunny Marks. He was a fighter pilot in Vietnam, so he had relevant combat experience, but from the aerial view. But I remember him and I and my parents just sitting at dinner and I probably killed 2 bottles of wine by myself. And I don't, no empathy, numbness, just sat there getting fucking wasted,
yeah,
and having a conversation with a World War II or a Vietnam veteran who flew, jets.
yeah.
And yeah, it was you're absolutely right. It's just you're completely lost in what's going on and you don't care about anybody or their experiences and you're just suffering in your own.
Yeah, yeah, and it's one of those traps that I think a lot of us fall into. And I stayed there until my breakdown happened. I mean, I pretty much was drunk that whole first year home. I'm embarrassed to say it, but it's true. Um, but man, I did so much damage to myself that first year, and my whole life revolved around alcohol. And because of the DWI that I'd had, when I went to get an apartment, I specifically chose an apartment right by the bars so I could just walk back and forth between the bars. And man, I wish I could take the wisdom I have now back to that, 22-year-old kid
Mm-hmm.
and have helped him out a little bit. I don't know if that 22-year-old would have accepted the help. It's hard to say.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the breakdown I had was really essential to me being willing to change. But really, the land of the Lotus Eaters, I think, is reflected in this, you know, this um this ancient tale. And because it's a universal experience, I think a lot of veterans, and not just from our wars, but uh, going back as long as there has been war,
Yeah.
have fallen into this same trap of having so much to process and not having the tools to do it. And a lot of times you're just taking the path of least resistance, and a lot of times that has to do with alcohol.
Yeah. And I will applaud you for 14 years of sobriety. I never let alcohol consume me to that level. I'd say, I have I, gone too far? Absolutely. But I've also gotten to the point now where I will not drink around anybody I don't trust, or that I know cannot control me. And most of the time, I just don't drink because I don't like losing control. I
Right.
like always remaining in control. But kind of like what you described, the land of the Lotus Eaters, they were consuming lotuses as a means to forget the horrors they witnessed. Alcohol and drugs, which is alcohol and drugs, and is a modern correlation for that epic poem. But for those who are suffering and recognizing that they have pain that they're suffering from, how can we best help someone in a situation who doesn't even want to be helped, or turns to alcohol as the first chance that they get?
Yeah, so this is a tough question and a tough one to answer. But so a few things. So one of the things that has always stuck with me um is I remember when I took my first class in addictions when I was studying counseling psychology, get my master's, and I remember I had this jaded old professor walking. He'd been in the addiction uh, counseling profession for I think like 30 or maybe even 40 years. But he strolls in and he sets his stuff down. He's like, "Look, you don't need to get out your notebooks. You don't need to take any notes. You don't really need to do anything in this class." He said, um, "There's only one thing I need you to remember, okay? There's only one thing." He said, "People are going to stop using or drinking. They're going to stop doing whatever they're doing for one reason and one reason only, and that's negative consequences. When they are suffering so much, when they lose the things that are most precious to them, when things completely fall apart, or when it's just too painful, when the hangovers are not worth it, when they lose their job, when they get fired, when somebody threatens to leave them, when they make a big mistake and cause a lot of damage, they are going to be determined to drink." And he said it's not going to be until that happens that they're going to be ready. And but when they get to that place, that's when your job really starts. When somebody has hit the wall and they realize they've made the mistake and they know they need to change, that's when you can help them.
Hmm.
And I have quite a few clients who are recovering from some form of alcohol or substance use, or who are still struggling to try to get sober. And a lot of them struggle with shame, and it's really hard for them to talk about or to be honest about what they're struggling with. And I'd say, man, if anybody listening has somebody they know that they can just tell that somebody's having a hard time with this, and if you've got a friend that they know they're not living their best life and that this is getting in the way, be the kind of friend that they can talk to about these things without being shamed or having somebody be too hard on them. Because a lot of the folks I know that are struggling with this still, what they need is someone they can go to say, "Hey, I want to go out tonight. I want to have fun, but I need you to not let me drink. I need," or, "Hey, I want to have a beer, but you got to make sure I don't use cocaine." you know? I mean, so a lot of folks are at these different points where like people are struggling with things that you might not have any clue they're struggling with. But they often need someone to be guardrails for them, to help them set boundaries for themselves, or to even say, "Hey, dude, I don't even think it's a good idea for you to have a beer.
Hmm.
If this is out of your control, let's not go out. Let's not do that. Let's do something completely different tonight. Why don't we do something that does not involve alcohol? Or you know what? Hey, man, instead of next weekend, instead of going out to the bar, fuck that, dude. Let's get our stuff together. Let's go camping. Let's go camping and let's go fishing. Let's do something fun and sober and talk about the life we want to build for ourselves, you know? But be the kind of friend that can help someone imagine new possibilities that don't revolve around drugs or alcohol, you know, and
Yeah.
help them be the guardrails that they need, and ask them, you could say, hey, what kind of boundaries do you need to be able to reach your goals here? You know, what else can you work toward? What else is so important to you that you'd rather invest in something else than invest in this?
Yeah.
What about getting your health in shape or where it needs to be? Whatever it is for the person. So,
The positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement never helps. You always have to leave the negative reinforcement out because then they're just going to go into a deeper depression and
bingo.
just fall back into their old ways. Whereas that positive reinforcement and showing them new beginnings, um, yeah, it's absolutely going to assist in their journey to
Bingo.
sobriety and to a
Yep.
good life and health.
Yeah. Anywhere where there's alcohol and substance use too,
Hmm.
um, or at least abuse, um, a lot of it has some relationship too with the person not having great emotional regulation skills.
Hmm.
And so I talk to people all the time. Every single week, I talk to someone who, when they tell me what they're struggling with, well, tell me what's going on. Tell me what are some of your main symptoms? When do they happen? And then I say, well, what usually helps? What kinds of things do you do that to make it better? And most guys I talk to, they don't say like, go for a run, meditate, journal. They don't say things like that.
Hmm.
They say, I'll take a gummy. I'll smoke weed. I'll have a couple beers. Like the responses um, mostly tie back to some form of escape with the help of some substance.
Yeah.
Um, and when we don't have good emotional regulation skills and strategies, we often will rely on like an easy out, because we're suffering, we're really uncomfortable. And man, frankly, I mean it's hard work. It's damn hard work to figure out like, well, what do I do with this anxiety? Or what
I
do I do with this anger or this depression? It's not easy to just, learn that overnight. It's a big investment, and you kind of got to be sober to do that work.
So I kind of correlate what we're talking about to another book I read called Coaching Champions, and it was written by a gentleman named Lanny Basham, who is a gold and silver medalist at the Olympics. And he wrote this book after he wrote the book with winning in mind, but this book it's kind of raising your children to become champions, and so I kind of look at this process almost like raising a child, like what we talked about before with the positive reinforcement. Your children is never going to gain the confidence if you kind of tell them everything that they do wrong.
Right.
Whereas if you can just point out all the positives in their life and like we'll use the example in the book, like, or, what it's referring to. Like like this weekend, I was teaching my daughter how to shoot a gun. Did she get everything perfect? No, but I took everything that she did do right and showed her how she can get better at doing those things right. That way it leads to a level of confidence to where we can start working on the next step to
Yeah.
make that part even more perfect. And it's just that positive reinforcement of, hey, we got this going. Let's
Yeah.
try this now and let's just keep going from there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, finger wagging doesn't do, there's not a lot of people out there that are going to respond well to finger wagging. And
Hmm.
especially when people are dealing, I mean, there's often so much shame wrapped up in substance and alcohol use.
Yeah.
And so causing someone to feel more shame, is usually not going to be productive. It's probably going to backfire and lead them right back where they were.
And they're gonna lead to a deeper and darker depression because they think that you think that they're a failure now, and whenever they think you think they're a failure and that you're somebody that they look up to, it's just gonna set it off even
They're
to
not going to they're
yeah,
not going to come back and tell you next time.
yeah, they're gonna hold it in.
Yep. Unless they specifically have requested, "Hey, I need you to confront me with this.
Yep.
Hey, I need you to hold me to I need you to hold my feet to the fire."
Hmm.
Unless they've asked for it, it's better to approach it with compassion.
Yeah. So, can you expound upon how our upbringings and the way we were raised can have a direct correlation on the way we handle challenging situations in life? And then talk to us about the emotional skills regulation questionnaire.
100%. Yeah. So, man, I tell you what. So I've got a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and I do this. This is part of every single day. And not to mention, like in being a psychotherapist, I'm often helping clients do what their parents never helped them to do when they were kids. And so a few things. So, there's a lot of interesting science when it comes to emotional regulation and psychological development. And one of the interesting things as it relates to all this is just that we start to learn to regulate our emotions even just as newborns, as infants, and that when our parents are able to regulate their emotions, um, they are helping us as infants to learn to regulate ours. But if you have a deeply distressed parent who is not able to regulate their emotions, they are not going to be able to help the kid do the same. And there's this irony. I mean, God, I just like, I'm like covering my face as I say this, and it just makes me cringe. But I had a dear friend share with me yesterday that he supports corporal punishment and like you know people hitting kids at schools and stuff.
Mm,
And I was just like, it was so hard to hear that and so confusing for me. And it was in relation to a video where a lawmaker in Oklahoma was proposing a bill to allow corporal punishment in schools, which is just wild.
yeah,
But there are so many problems with this. But one of them is a lot of times kids are making bad decisions because they haven't learned to regulate their emotions. And they're not going to learn to regulate their emotions any better when the authority figure or the caretaker or the parent in their life cannot regulate their emotions. And so when a kid is acting out and upset, and I mean, I see it out in public, I'll be out at the store and you'll see a kid crying and throwing a fit. And, they're like 3 years old or whatever. And it's like they don't have a prefrontal cortex.
hmm,
They do not have the same equipment that we have. So it's like a lot of limbic system going on back there, fight or flight, and all these reactions. But they do not have the advantage of a fully developed prefrontal cortex that the adults have.
hmm,
And you'll watch these kids throwing a fit, and then you'll watch the parent losing their temper and then threatening the kid, which is, of course, just going to cause more fear and a bigger emotional reaction. And you're asking them to keep their stuff in check when the parent's not even keeping their stuff in check. And so it's kind of ironic a lot of times. And that the parent is asking the kid to do something that they themselves in this very moment are not even able to do themselves. And so, in terms of our upbringing and what happens to us in childhood, um, if we didn't have someone around us that could regulate their emotions and stay calm, um, then that's usually something we have to learn to do as adults.
hmm.
And it's not something that happens magically. But all the time. So my kids are different. My 4-year-old, more or less a piece of cake. And when he was really little, he liked to watch Daniel Tiger. Even as like a, 18-month-old, 2-year-old, he watched Daniel Tiger. And there's a little song in there about, that if you get angry, take a deep breath and count to 4. And so when he'd be really upset, I'd grab him and I'd sing the song to him. And then we'd count and I'd say 1, 2, 3, 4. And he would take a deep breath and he would sigh. And almost every time he'd stop crying and he'd calm down. And I'd say, "What's going on, buddy? Can you use your words? Can you tell me what's going on?" And these are really important emotional regulation skills. So being able to name what you're experiencing, being able to label it, and to explain why you're feeling the way you are, that is so important. And right now, I mean, you know, I've had clients who are in their 30s, and I'll say, "I can tell you're really upset right now. Can you tell me what you're feeling?" And they will say, "I don't know. I don't know." That they never learned to be able to say it, and they were so deeply traumatized as children that it has impaired them, maybe even permanently, in some cases. And so the amount of work that they have to put in now
They
is
never
just.
they it's like they never develop that level of self-awareness to really understand what they go through.
Yeah, and like frankly, it's like the neural net, like the neurological wiring, like to
It's
be able,
broken.
it's yeah, that's trauma. It's the effects of the trauma are so significant that it is literally like it's like a disability, frankly. It really is. And I have clients who experience alexithymia where they really have a difficulty naming their emotions. They're very distressed, but it's hard for them to put a finger on it. And that's a huge and really big problem because if you cannot label or name what you are feeling, like that one scan, they've done fMRI scans, functional MRIs, where they look at what's going on in your brain, and they have people take practice different emotional regulation skills. But when you just label what you're feeling, and you can say, "I'm experiencing anxiety." That one act, that one act deactivates portions of the amygdala, which is kind of like the fire alarm for the brain, the smoke detector, and it activates different parts of the prefrontal cortex that help us gain a sense of control over our experience so we can change and control it. So if you can't name it or label it, you are at such an extreme disadvantage to be able to calm down. And so much of, the childhood stuff, it's foundational. It can leave lifelong effects. And, all this stuff, of course, sets somebody up that if they don't have these basic skills, it sets them up for, greater possibilities of like severe psychopathology, alcohol use, substance use, all of it, you know.
No, no, that's that. I've often said, you could generally tell how a person was, raised as a child, which will determine how they handle certain situations, and that makes perfect sense.
Bingo. Yeah. Yeah,
Uh,
my wife, we had to come up with a new strategy for my daughter. So I've got a 2.5-year-old, and she's formidable. She's a tough, determined kid. And when she's got her mindset on something, it's very hard to redirect her.
hmm
But and when she's upset, she's upset. These are big feelings. It's
hmm
intense and it's severe, like it's real emotional distress for her. And so it's nothing to scoff at or ignore. Um, but she will withdraw when she's
hmm
really upset. And so it's just like, how you like, when you're trying to potty train a kid, sometimes potty candy's involved.
hmm
You get a reward for going to the bathroom. I've started doing like candy for her just talking to me, when she's really upset. And because she does not want to talk, she withdraws, she's very angry and very hard to calm her down. And if we just ignore this, if we just blow it off, there's going to be problems one day.
hmm
And so what I'll do is I'll just soften up, be very patient, and she'll really lash out. And I'll just sit there and I'll have like two M&Ms in my hand and I'll say, "Hey, look at what Daddy's got for you." And I'll say, "Will you come talk to me and tell me how you're feeling? And you can have these M&Ms." And so it's gotten to the point now where she'll come and sit on my lap, take the M&Ms and put them in her mouth, and then she'll tell me what she's upset about. But it's like you got to be creative, I think, and that man, a lot of times, I mean, a lot of us did not have parents, especially growing up in, the
The 80s
80s,
and the 90s.
yeah, yeah, 90s, 80s, 70s, 60s, whatever. Dude, most of us, our parents were not too astute with this stuff.
Mm-mm.
So it was more old school.
Mm-hmm.
You're gonna cry, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yep. Here's the belt. Here's here's the paddle. You
Yeah,
know, that was the way back then.
yeah.
So, throughout history as well as cultures throughout the world, we can see a correlation of what soldiers in those tribes and societies have gone through. Each have different names for what we call post-traumatic stress.
Yeah.
What are some examples in recent history that these cultures have used to help their warriors become whole again?
Ask me that question one more time. What are some examples?
What are some examples in recent history that these cultures have used to help their warriors become whole again?
Okay. Yeah. Great question. And yeah, so Ed Tick, who worked with veterans for over 40 years before he kind of retired, he's more or less, kind of doing his own thing now. But he worked at the VA, but he also used to take veterans to Vietnam to do healing retreats and stuff. So he's done so much important work, but he's documented over 80 names from around the world for what we refer to as post-traumatic stress. And some of them emphasize different parts of warriors' experiences, everything from like being lost or feeling like they've lost a part of their soul to feeling like they're being haunted by a ghost. And so the different cultures emphasize different parts of these struggles. But the oldest example I'm aware of like a healing ceremony came from like a fairly recently discovered tablet, something that was discovered in like the last 15, 20 years. But they found a tablet written with cuneiform, and when they interpreted it, it had a ceremony for returning warriors that involved them lighting a torch and saying a prayer to demand that the ghosts that were following the warriors home follow them no further. So it was kind of a ritual and a boundary setting where they asked the ghosts to stay behind,
Hmm.
and they honored them. And so um, that's the oldest example I know of. And I want to say that that's like something like 2,500 or 3,000 years old. It's been a long time, so I don't remember exactly. But in more recent memory, in more recent history, um, there have, I'd say, probably some of the more recent examples we would have that have some like deep symbolic meaning would be from the Native Americans, or from Africa. So the Native Americans to this day still do the enemy way ceremony, which is a homecoming ceremony for returning warriors, and they follow it just like they did in probably more ancient times. Um, and so those things have continued, and it's actually really special. I mean, it's something that you can actually buy a book and read kind of an overview and through the Navajo Enemy Way ceremony. Um, Another example would be in Africa. So Carl Jung,
Hmm.
and this is fascinating, I think. But Carl Jung kind of did a tour of Africa as part of his study, just trying to understand different aspects of the psyche and how people relate to these things differently. And he found that in Africa, they don't greet their warriors And granted, this is over 100 years ago now, but they didn't greet their warriors with like a celebration and lifting them up and praising them. They fed them raw vegetables and forced them to live in a hole. So they treated them kind of as like, you know, uh, lowly citizens in a way. Like they didn't honor them, they put them in a low place. And the rationale for this was that when somebody, ends up in a really inflated state where like you're almost like a god when you take someone else's life.
Hmm.
Like you're all powerful. You can kind of get drunk on rage when you're in combat and just feel like you're absolutely, unstoppable. But when you get caught up in like that berserk place and you kind of lose touch with your humanity, in Africa and different tribes, they recognized that you had to help a person become human again, and you have to help them suffer a deflation or a regression, so they can separate from that, warrior identity and connect with like a more humble human part of their experience. And one of the things that I think is interesting about that, and when I say this, I don't want to sound like I'm suggesting that this is a good thing, but of course, when guys came home from Vietnam, they were treated like shit.
Hmm.
And, one has to be curious about the possibility that is it possible that that in a backwards kind of way might have helped some of them to let go of the warrior identity so they could transition versus what we do now in today's culture where we're basically worshipped and encouraged to remain veterans forever and ever and ever. I mean, you look at like different, famous veterans out there that, um, you know, as long as you're getting rewarded for this image from like 20 years ago, when are you going to stop? You
Yep.
know? So,
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's heartbreaking to see what those guys went through, but like when we had that discussion with Carl Marlantes, it's kind of gone overboard. Like
yeah,
like we you shouldn't be cheered for when to me it was always awkward, like we discussed. Like that's just an awkward situation to be in. It's like, hey, we were over there doing our jobs. Like, I got it. We want to put a different image out there today compared to what happened in Vietnam. But there's a level that it needs to stop.
yeah,
Like we're normal human beings like everybody else. We just went and had to do some extraordinary things.
yeah. Yeah, it needs like a soulful um response to the returning warrior does not mean cheering them in an airport. I mean, somebody who might have been just killed somebody days earlier,
Hmm.
um, probably isn't going to feel so great about getting applause.
Yeah.
Uh, but that just goes to show how little the average civilian really understands about, what it's like to go to war.
And I think, and I could be completely off base here. I think it can kind of cripple, a service member, even after service, in the way they carry themselves and the way they hold themselves compared to everybody else.
Mhm.
Um, this past weekend, when I went to go buy Lily her first pistol, um, I struck up I was in a conversation with the guy at the counter, and one of the other workers was there too, and it was an older lady. She had a son who served, I want to say eight years in the Marine Corps, and he'd been out for about 10 years now. And she asked me, she's like, "How long have you been out now?" I was like, "About 2 years," and she's like, can you tell me what your transition period was like? And I was like, I'm still transitioning. I'm still trying to figure out who I am in a sense, and it's a process that will always continue to grow. And she kind of described what her son was going through. He hadn't been able to hold jobs. He was always angry, aggressive, and just overinflated. His marriage of 19 years was suffering. His wife was about to leave him, all this kind of stuff. And, this is somebody I had just met, and she's kind of just talking to me about this stuff. And, what I told her is I was like, look, have him read Odysseus and the Oar, have him read What It's Like to Go to War by Karl Marlantes. I was like, here's my podcast. And like, we kind of kept talking. I was like, look, here's my phone number. You know, he's never going to listen to anything you have to say because your mom, and he's going to look at it as if you don't know what I go through. You don't rate to tell me what's going on in my life. I was like, just have him give me a call. If he calls, he calls. If he doesn't, he doesn't. That's a decision he's going to have to make. But here's an option. Just have him give me a call, and I'll do what I can to help him. But ultimately, it's a decision that he's going to have to make for himself. Have him call his buddies, reconnect with people. Um, I think the pomp and circumstance on returning home has gone to a way to where it has kind of crippled people into thinking they're better than what they actually are.
Yeah. 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 Just, I mean, I think, and I'm a fan of Black Rifle coffee, so I don't want it to sound like I'm talking smack.
Hmm.
But like, the Black Rifle brand, and like you'll see the videos they put out and stuff,
Hmm.
which are really catchy. And I mean, frankly, it's like I like them,
Hmm.
right? But I think that as a veteran, one of the reasons I like him is it kind of keeps this whole identity alive. And yet for me, like I'm outside of it most days. I mean, I'm not caught up in that mentality or that way of being, but I do know that there are veterans who are
Hmm.
like that is their whole entire life, and they are stuck, and
Yep.
their lives are not going well, and they've not been reborn. They've not found a new life yet. They've not found who they really are. They're stuck, and they're not living a healthy, happy life. They're
Yep.
miserable.
Yep.
They're absolutely miserable. And the one thing they have is, that identity which they cannot let go of. And we've kind of created superheroes or superstars out of some of the folks in the veteran community. And that's like one of the things that's like, man, here we are. People talk about 22 a day or 20 a day or 17 a day or whatever, you know, and wanting veterans to stop committing suicide and wanting to do something about like the veteran mental health crisis. And a lot of times these like superstar veterans, they're promoting an image that causes a lot of other veterans to want to be like them.
Hmm.
And the veterans who want more than anything to be like them are the ones who have the least good things going on in their life. Like people who are stuck, those are the ones who really worship those guys.
Yeah.
And and it's basically keeping them stuck. It's like we've created this superstar image, superstar veteran image that I think is counterproductive to our goals as a community, frankly.
Hmm.
And again, not a criticism of Black Rifle. I want to be very, very clear about that. But it's something that we need to be considerate about is just like how we hold ourselves in terms of like a persona, you
Yeah.
know?
So, the last thing I have, and you kind of talked about this at the beginning, but this kind of leads into the next chapter, which we'll get into in next month's episode. But you talk about meeting the shadow and the individuation process, which is the next chapter that we'll cover, is focused on. Can you quickly talk to us about what it is to meet the shadow and what this individuation process is?
Yeah. I'll give a little overview, like on a mythological level, right? So we'll give a little
Hmm.
example from a story. And we'll pick an easy one, just a brief one. But everybody's familiar with like the Frog Prince story, right?
Yep.
And so here's a princess, and she's playing with her golden ball. This ball is very precious to her. As long as she has this golden ball, she feels connected to life and like her vitality and all that. But one day she drops her golden ball and it rolls into a well, and she is crushed. I mean, because this ball means a lot to her. But this slimy frog comes along And he's like, "Hey, I can get your ball." And um and she's like, "Wow, that would be great. I'd love if you get my ball for me." And he's like, "But you have to give me a kiss. There's like a deal here. If I get you the ball, you have to give me a kiss." And she's like, "I can't do that." And he's like, "All right, well, no ball then. I really need you to give me a kiss." And she's like, "Well, the hell with it. Please just go give me the ball." So the frog gets the ball, brings it to the princess, but the princess breaks the deal. She snatches the ball and she runs off. Well, the frog follows her home, and when he gets there, he approaches the king and the queen. The frog says to the king and the queen, "Hey, here's a story. Your daughter, asked me for the ball. I got it for her. She said she'd give me a kiss. She didn't. She ran off." And so the king and the queen go to their daughter and they say, "Princess, you got to make good on your deal here. You got to kiss the frog." And so the princess takes the frog to her bedroom, and though it's the last thing in the world she wanted to do, she did not want to kiss this frog. She wanted nothing to do with it. She just wanted her ball back. But she's compelled. She realizes this is something she's going to have to do if she wants to keep the ball. And so she kisses the frog, and when she does, it breaks a spell that had been put on the frog. It turns out that this slimy, detestable, gross frog was not really a frog after all. He's actually a handsome and wealthy prince who has all of these riches to share with the princess. And that this story is like countless other stories. There's an element of this in the Odyssey when Odysseus meets Polyphemus. You can see it in the Epic of Gilgamesh when Gilgamesh meets Enkidu. You
Mm-hmm.
can see it in Iron John when the youth of that story meets Iron John. And in all these stories, this shadow figure is like some kind of gross, detestable thing. And the main figure in this story, and if we stick with like the princess and the frog, the princess would be an image of the ego, you know, that
Mm-hmm.
here's the ego being the I or the me, which is the center of subjective consciousness. It's like the center of what I think is me. But there is a larger center of objective consciousness, which Jung calls the self. It's like the totality of the entire personality. The ego is just one part of the personality, not the entirety of the psyche. And that in dreams and in myths, all these other figures, like the frog or all these other figures, these are non-ego images. This is something outside of the ego, which broadly we can refer to as shadow. So this is something that is unconscious. It's a part of the psyche we are not aware of, that we don't know, and that think about it this way, okay? If you are going through a crisis, it is usually because the ego has met its limits. So just like we were talking about earlier, you come home from war, you don't know how to deal with the chaos and the hardship that comes out of that. The ego doesn't know what to do with it. The ego has not yet adapted psychologically and emotionally to know what to do about the suffering it faces. And so it has to grow and it has to adapt. And that when we fall into the land of the Lotus Eaters and we start drinking or using drugs or whatever, we're skipping the adaptation. We're finding kind of like a pseudo adaptation that allows us to get by for now. But it's not a real, true, actual, legitimate solution. It's not a transformation of consciousness. It's not us really growing or changing so that we can be more whole and more equipped to overcome the challenges we face. And every time that we hit a wall, as we're going through a challenge and we hit a wall and we realize we don't have the skills, the tools, the awareness, the wisdom to get through it, if we don't have it, the ego doesn't have it. So where's it going to come from? It has to come from the unconscious. It has to come from the shadow. It has to come from the part of the self that we have never known and can't know until we're in this sort of a predicament. And so it's the shadow, the unconscious that brings up these new possibilities and confronts the ego with it. And every time that we run into this situation, we always experience these new things as gross and detestable, right? So how many veterans do you know that have seen someone cry and they're like, "Oh, look at that snowflake. What a crybaby snowflake." Well, that's shadow.
Hmm.
That's projection of the shadow that you see this other thing that could actually help you, that if you were to get in touch with your emotions and learn how to express your own pain, that could actually help you overcome a lot of the challenges you face. But you see it as a slimy, gross, detestable frog. You see it as a snowflake, as something undesirable, as something you want to put down and imagine is all bad, when really it could be really good and restorative and healing for you to integrate.
You look at
So,
it as weakness.
exactly. And when it's really a strength, right? So the ego always tends to devalue these non-ego aspects of the self for the most part. Either devalues them or it can idealize them. So
Hmm.
sometimes you see these things outside of yourself, you're like, oh my gosh, that's the best thing ever. I want to be more like that. So you see somebody who's jacked and covered in muscles, and it's easier to idealize that and say, I want to be like that guy.
Yep.
And really, like, yeah, maybe you want to be jacked and covered in muscles, but maybe you actually don't want to be like that guy. Maybe that guy's a complete dick, right?
Hmm.
And so it's like sometimes we idealize things when really we shouldn't, even if they do hold value for us. And sometimes we devalue things even if we shouldn't. And so this slimy, detestable frog in the Frog Prince story represents an element of the shadow that is actually a source of wealth and richness that can be a blessing to the princess. Same thing with Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Same thing with Polyphemus in the Odyssey. And then in all these stories, right, that it's the shadow, it's the aspect of the self that we don't yet know that has the power to introduce us to parts of ourself and parts of our potential that we haven't yet known to help us become more whole, more mature, and better able to overcome the challenges we face. So that's what it is to meet the shadow in a nutshell.
Okay. No, I appreciate that. And again, I really appreciate you continuing to come on here and talk to us about this and about the journey. And I'm really looking forward to discussing the next chapter. But before we do sign off, is there anything you'd like to say before we go?
No, take care of yourselves. Anybody who's listening, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. And that, I guess, if you made it this far, that there's something in here that's speaking to you. And I just want to encourage everybody to lean into their inner work and know that if you're going through a hard time, you're suffering. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, but just imagine, where it is you want to see yourself and spend some time investing in that image and reach out to people for help. You can reach out to the team that I work for at the Battle Within. Go to thebattlewithin.org. Apply for our programs. We got the 5-day Revenant Journey program for veterans and first responders, as well as the Frontline Therapy Network, where we can help you connect with a therapist. But that 5-day Revenant Journey program is meant to do the work that we're talking about here in this episode, where we are coming into contact with these parts of ourselves that we haven't yet known, and learning to transform and change so that we can overcome these inner challenges.
Well, again, thank you. And to the listeners, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If there's anything you'd like us to continue talking about, or if you'd like to get a hold of me or Adam, just please reach out and we'll help wherever we can. But thank you, and we'll speak to you next time.